In this program, Joseph begins with a personal reflection on the roots of his own interest in mythology, and goes on to offer his insights into the essence of Eastern philosophy as it has come to the West. He also discusses the spirituality of primitive cultures and the gifts they offer modern society, the nature of the vision quest, facing the demons of our self-imposed limitations, the problems of remaining active in life while also being compassionate and turning the other cheek, plus much more. This conversation took place in October 1980, when Joseph was 76. We began with a question about Joseph's early childhood introduction to the world of myth. Joseph, beyond the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and the totem room at the Museum of Natural History, how did you really become interested in mythology and the study of mythology? What happened?
Well, I think I would have to put it back to having been brought up a Roman Catholic and taking it very, very seriously as a boy, and realizing as I was reading the American Indian myths that the same forms were appearing there in a totally different culture context. And very early, I became interested in this comparative realization. And then in my university years, I was specializing in literature of the Middle Ages. And there, the Arthurian traditions, and back of that, of course, the classical mythologies. These brought forth the same images again in a context that was that of the Christian tradition, and yet inflected toward the more universal point of view that is that of the comparative approach. So this was it.
Much of your work is focused on the East, the Orient, and Oriental philosophies and the spiritual traditions of the Orient. How did you first become interested in that area?
Well, that happened when I was a student in Europe. Actually, I met on a steamer back, I think it was 1924, Jiddu Krishnamurti and Raja Gopal, his friend, and his brother Nityananda, who died the next year. And that was my first encounter with the Orient at all. And a young woman who was on the boat was associated with them, and she gave me a copy of Edwin Arnold's Light of Asia, which is the life of the Buddha, which was the first I ever heard of all this. And then when I went to Europe as a student, I started, after a year in Paris, discovering modern art as well as doing my research in medieval material. In Germany, I started Sanskrit and just became fascinated, that's all. And later then, long years later, after I had been teaching and writing, I met Heinrich Zimmer, who was a major Indologist. And at the time of his death, his widow asked me to edit his American lectures, and I went way deep into the Orient. I also was helping Swami Nikhilananda edit and translate out of Bengali the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and I knew Kumar Swami and his work, and so it was a big load, and it all just opened this material out into vast, vast reaches.
Just brings to mind the influx of, particularly of Eastern religions into the United States and Western culture. And this started to occur in the 50s with the influx of Zen Buddhism, and then continued with other Eastern traditions coming here in the 60s and 70s. What do you think that presages? What do you think is coming as a result of that?
You must remember that when we're having teachers coming from the East, we're getting the best. There are also crude folk traditions in the East. That's not what we're getting. But the crude folk traditions in the West, that's what we've got. And our best teachers are not the ones that are most listened to. Let's put it that way to start. Now, the best teaching from the East is this one of the Dalai Lama. We had it from Sri Ramakrishna. We have it all over the place from the East, namely that there is a common consciousness, which is our own ground. And so in consciousness, we are one. Insofar as you identify yourself with the consciousness that moves and lives in your body, you've identified with that which you share with me. On the other hand, if you get a fix on yourself, and then your tradition, we've got it. then you've removed yourself from the rest of mankind. Now, what the Eastern teachers are telling us is the important thing is not what happened 500, 1,000, 2,000, or 2,500 years ago. Let's say when the Buddha was born and taught, or when Jesus was crucified. What is important is what's happening in you now. And what is important is not your membership in a religious community. What's important is what that membership is doing to your psyche. And it's within you that the divine lives. Our religions, our Western religions, tend to put the divine outside of the earthly world in God, in heaven. But the whole sense of the Oriental is the kingdom of heaven is within you. Who's in heaven? God is. Where's God? He's within you. And what is God? God is a personification of that world creative energy and mystery, do you see, which is beyond thinking and beyond naming. We think our God has not only been named and known, but he's given us a whole system of rules. Their view is quite different from that. This system of rules are not from God, they're from man. And they're man's clues to how to get to the realization of God. It's a quite different orientation. And it's one when you hear it, you say, ah, yes. Now, the wasteland might be said to be taking of these things literally, concretely, and the rejuvenation of the Arthurian Grail hero, that of recognizing these as of the dynamic of your own interior. Because we're all from a mysterious, trans-rational ground. The subatomic particles tell us that. We don't know what in heaven's name they are, and that's what we are. And then our mind is in this world of time-space relationships, and the mind must open to the impulse and statements of that primary precedent of the general consciousness.
You're mentioning the folk traditions reminded me of, in looking at some of these older cultures that have been around for centuries and early cultures, one of the major differences between some of these ancient cultures and our own is that the people really had a balance between being in touch with their deeper side, their innermost selves, and life on the pragmatic level. And we can look at the prehistoric caves they found in France and Spain, I believe, where they have shamanic drawings on the walls of these caves, and indicating that these people very much had a religious base, had a perception of the spiritual side of life. And somehow in our culture, we have to retreat from life to find it. We have to take a vacation, or we have to go off somewhere where it's not a part of our life. And we see that permeating our entire society, where somehow the spiritual is over here in a compartment, and on Sundays we get in touch with that, and it's not really a part of the rational or the pragmatic side of life. How about that?
Well, in the first place, until the 19th century and the rapid progress of the industrial transformation of the world, the conditions of life lasted a little while. You know, for generations, they were essentially the same. So that the manner of dealing with them and getting the spiritual sense of one's relationship to these activities could be developed and richly experienced. However, even in my lifetime, the conditions of life have changed so rapidly that just by the time you get yourself related to one set, another comes along. And I think part of the anxiety of our time is just the result of the rapidity with which change has taken place, and one cannot get a spiritual relationship to this rapidly changing practical problem. That's the how about it of this thing. Now, another important point that the Oriental traditions bring to us is you don't separate your practical life and your religious exercises. Religion isn't for Sunday or for Friday night. You see what I mean? It is for all the life of the whole day. For instance, we're in a religious exercise right now, you and I, Michael. Do you see what I mean? And our relationship, what is it that's playing in? It's through the life that one is to experience the Spirit, communicate the Spirit, and live in it. That's beautiful. And the whole thing of Zen Buddhism, you know, when someone says to the master, what is the Buddha? And he says, have you had your breakfast? Yes. Did you wash the dishes? Yes. All right? Another thing they say is if you see the Buddha coming down the road, run away. Because if you concretize the divine in any fixed image and say, there it is, you're off.
We're really talking about the great mystery, the ineffable.
That's what we're talking about. Yeah. It's exciting to talk about it.
Yeah. It just occurs to me that so often we relate to these other cultures as, quote, primitive. We have this word, primitive. And we see ourselves as civilized and advanced civilization. And yet we've lost so much of what was present in some of those primitive cultures, namely that ritual that existed through life that put people in touch with the ultimate.
Well, the word primitive properly just refers to the complexity of the mechanics by which people live. And they are primitive in that sense. I mean, just compare the way I got here by airplane with the way I would have had to get here in a really primitive time. I'd have had to walk from New York before even the horse was mastered. And that's a condition of very, very primitive people. But when you think of their spiritual life, just read any of the American Indian materials. These people lived in a divinely alive world. The man with the calumet about to smoke would point the stem first to the sun so that the sun could smoke. Then he addresses it to the four directions. And in praise of the divinity that's there, he participates in it himself. That is, the whole life is utterly religious. Crude as it may be in contrast to ours in terms of the mechanics of life. But ours, I would say, in terms of the spirituality of life, is the crude, primitive one, because we've lost the way to link it. And yet, it hasn't been lost. We don't listen to the people that are telling us how.
As we look to the future and we see ourselves in kind of a transitional society, where do you think myth comes in a transitional society which is kind of grasping at straws, as it were?
Well, myth comes in when you realize that the real judgment of life is not to be based on whether it's practical. The emphasis on practical, economic, and political ends leaves you without a ground, and the ground in the notion of what it is to be a decent and functioning and harmoniously put together human being. And it's that the myth has taught. I'm amazed reading some of these very, very, what we call primitive mythologies at the sense of decency in the human being, in his relationship to other members of his community. Not the community outside, but his community.
Going back to that brotherhood, the idea of brotherhood, I think of the American Indian when they had no concept of owning land. And it took the white man to come in and say, this is my land and it's not your land. And there were so many traditions that we came in and just sort of covered over and just destroyed with our perception of the way things worked.
Well, the most vivid contrast comes, and I heard this only last week, actually, this speech that Chief Seattle delivered when white men wanted to purchase his land. He said, how can you purchase what we don't own? Our brother Eagle, will you take care of him? The water, my father's blood, my father's voice is there. And this land, and that impresses me so. Here are people that had tough lives. I mean, it was real tough, but they loved it. And here we are having it soft, and many of us just think, oh, gee, as James Joyce says, is life worth leaving? We haven't learned to live it. And that's because I think of this it of the mechanical world roundabout. It's more difficult to think of this microphone before us as a loving thou than it is to think of a tree or a lovely little squirrel. And those people lived in a living world, and we're living in one that it's living on a very deep level. You know, the subatomic particles are there too, but it doesn't look that way.
Yeah.
So we're disengaged.
One of the aspects of mythology that's always been fascinating to me is the vision quest. We can see it in almost every culture. Every tradition has as its base the vision quest. What is the vision quest?
That is the basic myth. It is the quest of anybody, for instance, in this world that we're in now, which seems to be disengaged from vision. It's the quest for the visionary relationship to that world. That's to find a spiritual relationship to the world that you're in. As the world changes, the vision quest changes as well. Now, the first visions were those of the shamans in the caves, but their people were just very small groups compared with what is a people now. And when settled tribes, settled peoples began to be important in about the 10th and 9th millenniums BC, the larger communities, the problem of relating to those comes up, and we have more complicated priestly relationships than in the earlier shamanic, and the shaman goes out and the priest comes in, who represents the gods of the community. The shaman's deities were his own private familiars, whom he discovered in vision. The deities of a larger social group are inherited by the tribe, and the priest is the officer of those deities. He doesn't necessarily experience them as the shaman does. Now, that poetic experience is what we've got to have again. It's much easier to have a poetic experience in the beautiful mountains and forests of California than it is to have the poetic experience in the factories, let's say, of Detroit. But that's where it's got to go. And the vision quest to reactivate our world has to deal with our world.
Another aspect of the vision quest is the encounters with demons, and we have a tendency, I think, to push our demons under the rug and hope they'll go away, when in reality we really have to face them.
Our demons are our own limitations that shut us off from the realization of the ubiquity of the Spirit. And so as each of these demons is conquered in a vision quest, the consciousness of the quester is enlarged and more of the world is encompassed. I mean, basically, that's what it is. It's getting past one's own limitations. These are within, and they seem to be without. Conflict between two people is the result of their respective limitations with respect to each other and so forth. And these are symbolized in these myths. So that the monsters and demons of mythology are really symbols of limitations within the individual. And in each age, the characteristic limitations change. As a people changes, its limitations change.
Joseph, it just occurs to me, going back again to the idea of how we really have to, we are a global society now, and the global myth is one that we really have to understand in a much larger way than we have up to now. And I think of that limitation, how we often perceive other cultures as being very different from ours, and how we somehow want to make them like ours, that American democracy, for an example, has to spread to this country and that country. And in many cases, the nature of the people and the nature of the situation is so very different that democracy in the form that we understand it could never work. And we have to really not only relate personally, but we have to take that personal understanding of our limitations to a global understanding, don't we?
Yes, I would say that's a major problem. A major problem is seeing in someone who lives a different kind of life than the one that you regard as the proper one, the human being at the same time. This whole thing of conflict and love, where Jesus says, I say love your enemies. He didn't say don't have enemies. And you can become a slob on this thing and say, oh, everybody's just lovable, as though that person were not going to knock you in the eye. The problem of living as an aggressive, vital presence in the world, and at the same time having this universal consciousness is a major one. I've been enormously impressed, again, the primitive people who had to kill animals to live. But the attitude toward the animal was not of animosity. The attitude was of gratitude to the animal for yielding his body, and playing the universal game where life lives on life. I mean, that's the way we live. We have been removed from this because our butchers do the butchering for us, and then we buy a nice, neat lamb chop,
That's how we can come up with terms like megadeaths, because we're so far removed from it.
Depersonalizing the object of being killed. But what is it when you do the killing yourself? These people killed the animals, and we're grateful to them for giving their body. Now, there's a very interesting saying from the Rig Veda. It's in a small verse in the 10th book of the Rig Veda that has been a clue to me for how this thing has to go. And it says, on the tree of our lives, that's your life, my life, or the world's life, there are two birds, fast friends. One eats the fruit of the tree, and the other, not eating, watches. Insofar as we're active in the world, we're the bird that eats the fruit. And what is the bird doing? It's killing the fruit. It's consuming the fruit. And the fruit is yielding to the bird, The other, however, is indifferent to who wins. It's just watching this way of life. Now, in meditation, one can get so far onto the side of the bird that is watching that one can become unfriendly to the act of life. Do you see what I mean? And many people cut themselves off that way. Whereas the proper necessary attitude is to recognize the necessities of life, which have to do with competition, and affirm it, but not in the way of enemies, but in the way of participation in the game of being alive. Now, it's not too easy, but it's got to be done. One of the things that discredits the World Brotherhood point of view is the tendency to say, turn the other cheek and let him smack you down. That's depressing of life. That's wasteland stuff again, because life is active and tensions are the very source of energy. But the attitude toward them is what's important.
What are some of the things that we might be able to do to bring us more in touch with that understanding of what we've been talking about?
Well, since people get their messages from the clergy, they really do. In this country, they do. I've been around now a good deal, and in the cities we may say, well, the source of people's virtue and all is from their intellectual life and their own personal living and thinking and the community of the people they're with. But when you get out of the big cities, we're still in the area where the clergy are the great teachers, and they're the ones. It's up to them. It really is. And this is why the Oriental gurus are having such a success, because the clergy, by and large, are hanging on to old traditions by main force. And they are exclusive traditions. They're traditions that say, this is the way good people are, that's to say, the way we are, and others are different. How difficult it has been to change the ideas toward, let's say, abortion, in the face of rules from the past. The relationship of people to each other is changing, and yet not being recognized.
Joseph, you wrote the definitive book on the hero with 1,000 faces. And do you see that we have any heroes in our culture, in our society?
Well, popular heroes are right now, I think, very, very crude. I don't mean to say that the people who are the heroes are crude, but the order of life they represent is crude.
So maybe sports figures or movie figures.
Exactly. Or political figures. These are people playing the obvious game, but the deep spiritual masters and heroes are not the public heroes. I find, however, that in private life, people I talk to, they have heroes that are not those that are in the public media. A great hero is Jesus, for example. A great hero is the Buddha, and these figures are operative in lives, not very much in the popular way, but you see what people are reading. They start in the back of the paper, it's sports figures, Those are fine, but they represent only one aspect of life. That is that of physical well-being and competence and attention to the game. But then the intellectual or spiritual heroes, we don't hear so much about them. For me personally, when I was growing up, I had sports heroes, but also the heroes of my intellectual life. James Joyce was one, Thomas Mann another, and I think people have those heroes now as well, private to each. It's a world where we have many, many ways of life, and a single overall philosophy or hero giving is not possible anymore.
Joseph, I want to thank you. It's been an extraordinary and enlightening conversation once again.
Thank you, Michael. Always a real pleasure to be with you.